Thanks a lot. I was very excited to hear that I would be speaking with my great comrade and friend Trevor Ngwane, who's really a magnificent revolutionary fighter, an exemplary South African Marxist. So I hope we do get him back to finish what he was going to say. But what we're discussing is why Marx matters. And this is an easier question to address than it was in the recent past. The recent past, let's say the period between roughly, I would say the beginning of the 1980s and sometime in the 2000s, was one where Marx was, as he once put it about the great 17th century Jewish philosopher Spinoza, a dead dog. He was dismissed. This was the period in which overall neoliberalism was dominant, and inasmuch as there was critical thought, it was post-structuralism, post-colonialism, postmodernism, people like Foucault and so on, all of whom explicitly, in different ways, were critical of and rejected Marxism. Marx was a marginalised and forgotten figure. But it's very interesting how his bicentenary has been marked. The coverage in the kind of grand bourgeois publications, the ones that represent the ruling class at its most sophisticated, has been very respectful. An article in the Financial Times, for example, headlined "Why Marx is More Relevant Than Ever." Even The Economist managed to find good things to say about Marx. And it's important to ask why that was so. I think the answer is because capitalism is in such obvious difficulty. We had the crash of 2007 and 8, the Great Recession that followed it, and what we've seen, instead of a kind of robust recovery from that crisis, is a continued period of slow growth and very deep economic difficulties, what the Marxist economist Michael Roberts calls the long depression. And that means that the ruling class is much less confident than it was until recently. The gloss has gone off neoliberalism. They haven't abandoned it because it makes so much money for them. They're so rich thanks to neoliberalism. They're not going to let it go unless they're physically forced to abandon it. But they don't have the confidence anymore that it works. That's why even Theresa May talks about the problem of social inequality and the left-out families and so on and so forth. This is a reflection of how relatively defensive the ruling class is at the present time, not just in Britain, but internationally. Why does that make Marx important? For a very simple reason. At the core of his intellectual project is what he called the critique of political economy. All his major economic and some of his philosophical works are either titled or subtitled The Critique of Political Economy. And it's important to understand what he meant by critique of political economy. Political economy was the name that economics had in Marx's day. It was actually much better than contemporary economics. It was represented by people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And therefore, on the face of it, the critique of political economy is the critique of economics as a science, if you like. And indeed, Marx calls the project that becomes his great work, Capital, at one point a critique of economic categories. So what he's doing is critically examining the concepts and theories put forward by the political economists. But in fact, Marx's critique of political economy isn't just a critique of categories, it's also a critique of the economic system which those categories partly reveal and partly mystify. So he's offering a critique of capitalism as a system. Actually, no one had any idea of capitalism as a system. The very idea of capitalism as an economic system with its own distinct logic is something that we owe to Marx. It wasn't part of people's imagination. If you look at Smith and Ricardo, what they say about what Marx will call capitalism is much more, it's important in certain ways, but it's much more superficial. So Marx is the first and greatest theorist of capitalism as an economic system. And that's the reason why the bourgeoisie today feel that they have grudgingly to acknowledge his importance. As long as capitalism exists, Marx will be a key reference point. Now, Marx, in a series of great works, culminating in Capital Volume 1, which was published 150 years ago last year, in 1867, develops a systematic analysis of what he calls the capitalist mode of production. And he says it's defined by two fundamental contradictions, two fundamental conflicts. The first of these is the contradiction between capital and wage labour. Capital, Marx says capitalism is defined by the fact that capital, the money that is invested by the capitalists, grows, it expands. It's self-expanding value, as he puts it sometimes, more technically. And he poses the problem, where does that extra value, that surplus value, as he puts it, come from? And his answer is the exploitation of workers. Workers, the entire capitalist system rests upon workers, in other words, the people who lack the independent resources to support themselves, and so in order to live and for their dependents to live, they have to sell their labour power to a capitalist. And because the capitalist concentrates all this capital, all this money and what it can buy, machinery, factories, computers, office buildings, supermarkets, all the material wherewithal of capitalism, this is an unequal bargain, and the worker makes a deal that leads, as Marx puts it, to the worker getting a hiding, in other words, being exploited. And the bulk of Capital Volume 1 is an analysis of the capitalist process of production, in other words, showing how capitalism is organised in production to extract this surplus value from the workers that's the source of the capitalist profits. So that's one great contradiction. The second great contradiction is that among the capitalists themselves. The capitalist class is not a unified capitalist class. As Marx puts it somewhere, they're a band of hostile brothers. In other words, the capitalists are divided among themselves. They compete with each other. Each capitalist, each capital, each individual unit of the system, each firm, or sometimes each state, trying to grab as big a possible share of the surplus value for itself. And it's this competitive struggle that drives capitalism as a system, that gives it its dynamic. The dynamic is that, as Marx puts it, of accumulation. In other words, the capitalists do really well. They use some of the surplus value to give themselves, all the luxuries imaginable, and so on and so forth. But that's not what they do when the system's working properly, which it isn't at the minute. With the bulk of their profits, they reinvest in expanded and more efficient production. In other words, they try and enhance their competitiveness by investing in expanded and more efficient production. And this is what leads capitalism to expand dynamically as a system. And in the Communist Manifesto that Marx wrote with his great comrade Friedrich Engels in 1847-48, he praises capitalism as a very dynamic and revolutionary system that subverts existing relations, institutions and beliefs and so on and so forth. But when we put the two contradictions together, they lead to economic crises. Marx was one of the first to identify what these days is called the business cycle, the way in which capitalism moves through boom and slump with great regularity. And he argues that the fundamental cause of boom and slump is that the process of competitive accumulation leads capitalists to invest more and more in labour-saving technology. In other words, technology that allows them to dispense with workers. Think about all the stuff about automation and robots at the present time. The problem with that is that it's the workers' living labour, as Marx puts it, that creates profits. So if you shrink the workforce too much compared to the capital that you invest, you get less profits for your investment. You get what Marx calls a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, the rate of profit, the overall return on capitalist investments. And this is the underlying factor that is responsible for the crises that are endemic to capitalism as a system. In the manuscript of Capital, Volume 3, where Marx completes his great work, well, he never actually finished it, but he sort of finishes it in Volume 3. At the end of the section on the falling rate of profit, he writes, hence crises. In other words, it's this process, it's this tendency for the rate of profit to fall that is responsible for the crises of the system. And economists like Joseph Chonara and Michael Roberts, who I've just mentioned, my old friend and comrade Chris Harman, have showed in great detail how this tendency of the rate of profit to fall lies behind the contemporary period of crisis. But, as I said, Marx didn't properly finish Capital, but he told Engels how it was going to finish in a letter. He says it will finish with the class struggle and the breakup of the whole shit. He wasn't very parliamentary in his language. In other words, that he wasn't just portraying a kind of neutral academic account of capitalism as a system. He says capitalism is a system that has a trajectory, and the trajectory is towards death. Capitalism will die. It will die through its destruction arising from the class struggle that goes on all the time. Capitalism is based on class struggle. The boss is trying to squeeze more surplus value out of workers, but the class struggle becoming more intense as a result of the cycle of crises and the suffering that these crises cause, and so on and so forth. And this leads me to the aspect of Marx that still doesn't get much attention. These days, people say, OK, Marx was a great critic of capitalism. We can't do without Marx if we want to make sense of capitalism. But Marx's politics, oh, don't talk. Well, you get two versions. One version is Marx's politics was terrible. That's what The Economist says, for example. Marx's politics was awful, even if he had some insights into the difficulties of capitalism. The other version is just Marx was a theorist. You know, he spent all his time in the British Museum researching, writing drafts of Capital and so on and so forth. He remained in a theoretical laboratory and didn't draw in his own practice the political conclusions that he sought to set out. Now, this is absolutely wrong. And it's something in an article, in the latest issue of International Socialism, I've tried to challenge quite systematically. Marx was contemptuous of criticism, of critique, remember the critique of political economy, that doesn't have a practical expression, an expression in political struggle and political action. Marx was very fond of demolishing people he disagreed with. And one of the early books in which he does this is The Holy Family, which was supposed to be a short pamphlet. Engels wrote a few pages and then Marx took it over. But Engels, you have this letter where Engels says, it's turned into a huge book. How did you do that? And this is what Marx does all the time. Anyway, The Holy Family, the subtitle is Critique of Critical Criticism. In other words, he's attacking intellectuals who think that theoretical critique is enough. That, as he put it somewhere else, he says, the arm of criticism cannot substitute for the criticism of arms. Now, that's a nice phrase. The criticism of arms is, sounds pretty terrifying, but what he's saying is criticism that doesn't express itself in organisation and struggle is empty. So, his critique of capitalism is oriented towards its revolutionary transformation. And he has a very specific understanding of what this transformation will be. There were lots of socialists in Marx's day. all sorts of different socialist theories, critiques of capitalism, visions of the future, and so on. But they all tended to conceive socialism or communism, whatever they called the society beyond capitalism, as something that would be handed down to workers. Marx rejected this throughout his political life. Towards the end of it, in 1879, he says, in a letter with Engels, for the last 40 years, we have devoted our lives to the principle that the emancipation of the working class will be the act of the working class. In other words, no one will hand socialism to workers. Workers will liberate themselves. Out of all the pressures that capitalism imposes on workers will become collective resistance and action that will lead eventually to the overthrow of the system. Now, again, you can say, oh, well, that's very interesting and so on and so forth. But what did Marx do about realizing this idea? Well, he actually did a lot. That statement that the emancipation of the working class, I think how he put it in the text I'm going to mention, can only be conquered by the working class, is included in one of the founding documents of the First International, the International Working Men's Association, that was founded in 1864, partly as a result of Marx's initiative, and which he led till its effective collapse in 1872. So this is quite significant, isn't it? Marx seeks to translate his theory into practice through playing a central role in building the first international working class movement. You know, there's all this blah, 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 globalization, political action is only effective if it's on an international basis and so on. Sorry, Marx already didn't just know that, but was acting on that back in the 1860s. Now, there's a lot that one can say about Marx's work for the First International. I mean, it culminated in his defense of the Paris Commune, the rising of the working people of Paris in 1871, which was brutally crushed by, effectively, the forces of bourgeois society, but which Marx argued gave a glimpse of how workers could take power and govern their own lives in a radically democratic way. But that's not what I want to emphasize. I want to emphasize, rather, the way in which his work leading the First International involved a recognition of the importance of the solidarity of the exploited and the oppressed. So he said, in Capital, he says, the great event of our times is the American Civil War. Why does he say that? Not primarily because it was this huge industrialized war in which over 600,000 people were killed, but because it was fought over slavery. It was a struggle, it became a struggle to destroy the slave power, the slave system in the southern United States. Marx and Engels strongly supported the North in the Civil War, and Marx predicted that Abraham Lincoln would only be able to win the Civil War by using revolutionary methods, in particular by arming black slaves and ex-slaves to fight and destroy the power of their masters, which is indeed crucial to how the Union won the Civil War. And Marx was also inspired by the solidarity that workers in Britain, in particular, gave to the North in the Civil War. The slave plantations of the North produced cotton that was the raw material for the huge textile industrial complex that dominated the British economy in the 19th century. That complex ran dry as a result of the Civil War. The South hoped that would lead British workers to supporting them and supporting their breakaway from the United States. On the contrary, the workers campaigned, organised workers campaigned in solidarity with the North and for an ending of slavery. So that's an indication of workers supporting the struggle for emancipation of the oppressed and the most oppressed people in society, the slaves of the American South. But also, closer to home, there's the question of Ireland. Ireland in the 19th century is part of the United Kingdom. It's a subordinated, it's essentially a colony of the British Crown, that crown that we should be glorying in today for all its magnificent achievements. There's a struggle by the Irish for independence. Initially, Marx, this isn't a struggle that is it's utopian. The Irish can't break away. Britain is too strong. Capitalism is too integrated. But in the course of the 1860s, he comes to say, not simply can the Irish win, but it's crucial that they win. It's crucial that they win from the point of view of the working class in Britain itself. There's this brilliant letter he wrote to friends in the United States in 1870, where he says, well, the background is that Irish migrant workers were the unskilled muscle, probably actually quite skilled, but anyway, that's how they were treated and paid, of the Industrial Revolution. Who built the cities, the railway lines, the bridges, all the things that are celebrated in Victorian Britain? It was Irish migrant workers. They were a crucial component of the working class in Britain. So we see already this capitalism, in its early phase of industrialisation, is already crucially involves the rhythms of the movements of migrant labours across borders. But Marx says in this letter, if you go to every major city in Britain, you see it's split. It's split between the so-called native British workers who identify with the British state and probably celebrate royal weddings and things like that, are still subordinate to the British state, and the Irish workers who are despised as Catholic and so on. More than that, in the 19th century, the Irish are portrayed in essentially racist terms by the British ruling class. Punch, the so-called comic magazine of the English middle class that fortunately has died now, I think, used to have the most disgusting caricatures of Irish people. So Marx says there's this racist division between British and Irish workers. And he says this is the hidden secret of the impotence of the British working class. This is why the British working class can't effectively take on its ruling class. And it's supported and encouraged by the ruling class through the press, through the churches, and so on and so forth. It's a kind of preliminary sketch of some of the ideas that Gramsci later on would have about hegemony. It's a most brilliant letter in lots of ways. He says it's therefore crucial. Britain is the main enemy. Britain is the core of global capitalism. If British workers, if Irish independence is won, and if British workers support that struggle, this can lead to socialist revolution in Britain. So, and he's very clear, he says we should support the struggle of the Irish, not primarily for moral reasons, but out of self-interest. Unless the British working class identifies with those who are oppressed by its ruling class, they cannot overthrow capitalism. Now that's a specific argument about Ireland, and what actually happened in Ireland proved to be quite different in ways that it isn't appropriate to talk about now. But the principle involved there is crucial. The principle is that oppression, the different ways in which class society bears down on and subordinates people, whether because of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, all the different ways in which people are oppressed in class society, how they define themselves, all those different ways, gender identity and so forth. All these different oppressions don't simply cause suffering to those who are oppressed and shouldn't simply be got rid of for that reason. They should be opposed because they divide and weaken the working class. The working class can only become a political subject capable of making history and taking power and destroying capitalism if it fights against all these different oppressions. So when people say, Marxists say, the liberation of women or the abolition of racism is something to happen after the revolution, they couldn't be more wrong. The struggle against racism, the struggle against the oppression of women, the struggle against LGBT plus oppression, the struggle against all the different forms of oppression has to start now if emancipation is to take place. These are class issues as much as higher wages or opposing cuts in the National Health Service and so on and so forth. So, and this takes one back to something that Marx wrote very early on in some of his earliest writings, he says, the American, the French Revolution, and so on and so forth, they achieved political emancipation. They got rid of the whole old feudal structure, and they created societies in which you have formal political equality, equal citizenship rights, although in covering up all sorts of inequalities. But what we should be seeking is what he calls human emancipation. The total emancipation of humankind as a whole from all, not just economic exploitation, but all the different ways that people are oppressed, excluded, dominated, and so on and so forth. That is Marx's goal. You can't separate the self-emancipation of the working class from this goal of human emancipation. And what Marx did was to devote his life intellectually, but also practically, through the different kinds of organisation that he was involved in through his life, from the Communist League in the 1840s to the First International at its maturity. And it's important to say... 5 minutes? Good. Yeah, I should be shorter than that, but you never know. It's worth stressing that Marx is leading the First International, building the First International, at the same time he's writing Capital Volume 3. Capital Volume 1, the only bit that he actually managed to publish. Actually, he writes Capital Volume 3 at the time too, just in manuscript. It's that period, the early years of the First International, 1864 to 7, that he brings his economic masterpiece to as close to culmination as he takes it. So he combines theory and practice in the most direct way. But he's involved in organising, he's involved in building, he's committed to the development of revolutionary socialist organisation, not just in Britain, but on an international, indeed on a global scale. Since Marx, there have been all sorts of attempts to take that much further and to achieve much greater in the way of political organisation than he was able to manage. But nevertheless, he showed the way, and he brought out the fundamental principles that should guide revolutionary practice. That's what we in the Socialist Workers' Party try to continue today. Although I have to say, if Marx were to come back today, this particular day, got here a bit late, missed his actual birthday. He was always late for everything, so he returns a bit late, wanders around London that became his native city. Marx himself was a refugee, a migrant, and saw all this royal stuff. He would say, what the hell have my followers been doing since my death? Why are these bastards still grabbing so much money and attention? You need to hurry up, you guys. Come on, let's have the revolution.
It's Trevor Ngwane. Trevor embodies the unity of theory and practice. In 1995, in the first wave of local elections after the end of apartheid, he was elected as an African National Congress councillor in the giant township of Soweto near Johannesburg. He was then expelled from the ANC after objecting to its privatisation plans. In 2001, he helped found the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee and then the Anti-Privatisation Forum in 2002. These grassroots organisations became a model for community resistance. He's remained an activist in social movements and workers' struggles. Last year, he received his doctorate from the University of Johannesburg for his research on popular committees in South Africa's informal settlements. Trevor, hi. Please tell us about the relevance of Marx to the struggles that you've been involved with.
Thank you very much for having me on this panel. Yeah, Marx is very relevant today as we see rising poverty, unemployment, inequality. And we have tried to explain it here using Marx's tools of analysis. We think that the crisis comes from the contradictions of capitalism, of capitalist production, which is production for profit, not to satisfy the needs of the people. There is competition As a consequence, there is overproduction of goods and overproduction of capital. Also, we can notice that the crisis is not confined to one country or to one time scale, one period. It's a rolling crisis. It takes many forms. It moves from country to country. And in each country, in each region, in each continent, it adopts particular forms. For example, one can talk of or notice the form it takes in poorer countries, peripheral countries, and then also the form it takes in the richer countries. The other thing about the crisis is that the bosses, the capitalist class, there is no agreement among the world's ruling classes how to solve it. So everyone is coming with their own solution, and half the time the solutions are at odds with one another. You can see the European Union trying something, the USA, here in...
Trevor, I think we've lost you. Don't know if we're going to get the connection back. Hi, Trevor, can you hear us?
Yeah, I apologize profusely. I will start where Comrade Alex ended off about a revolution. So with capitalist crisis, we've seen many false solutions. I would even argue that the rise of neoliberal economics, neoliberalism, was such a false solution, which was exposed and hit a dead end in the meltdown of 2008. In South Africa, our government here in 1996 adopted a neoliberal economic policy, but there was no improvement in the lives of the people, of the working class. Indeed, there was no economic growth as promised. There was no flooding of foreign direct investment. And indeed, their argument that there would be trickle down, let us first give money to the big bosses, then it will trickle down to the working class, proved to be false, because during the 2000s commodity boom, the bosses made lots of money, but they pocketed the profits. They never shared any of that with the working class. And in fact, the Marikana massacre in the year 2012, when the police shot and killed 34 striking miners on the Platinum Belt, these miners were fighting for an end to the cheap labor system. They had also seen in the past decade or so the bosses making money, the platinum price hitting the roof, but they, the workers, had got nothing. So those are the false solutions of capitalism. An important false solution which we must note is the myth called Africa Rising. So in the past decade or so, there's been this idea that Africa is at last developing. Africa is the new frontier for capitalist development. This is because new gas reserves, oil reserves have been discovered in Africa. And there was this idea that Africa, because it has got a young population, it should provide, new markets for, the capital, which is, constipating the system. But what is happening is that despite this Africa Rising mythology, despite the extraction of mineral resources, increasing oil, gold, diamonds, rubber, the structure of the African economies have not changed. So they are still export focused. It's all about digging things out of the ground, shipping them off to Europe and America. There is no beneficiation. Indeed, there is no industrialization. In South Africa, we are experiencing the opposite. There is deindustrialization. So Africa Rising is a mythology, and in fact, what is happening is a new scramble for Africa's raw materials. Another false solution is this idea of emerging economies. China, to a lesser extent, India, Brazil. Now, these economies have formed themselves into a loose economic bloc of which South Africa is a part. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But this BRICS is not really taking us forward, nor is it anti-imperialist, nor is it another way of doing capitalism which will improve the lives of the majority of the people of the world. Indeed, we see China investing in Africa. They might have a slightly different style from the old colonialists, but they are still focused on extraction, on taking out Africa's raw materials. And the infrastructure they are helping to build is still linked to building roads and railways to actually ship resources out of Africa to Europe and other centers, including China. South Africa itself tries to locate itself as a leader of Africa, but it is clear that it is playing what you can call a sub-imperialist role. It is becoming a bridgehead to allow, the old imperialists and the new imperialists in the form of China to actually make their way into Africa and exploit Africa's resources and Africa's working class. Let me just focus towards the end on South Africa. Now, we had a president called Jacob Zuma, who has been kicked out. And the reason he was kicked out is because across the class lines, there was this idea that there is poverty in South Africa, the economy is not doing well because of corruption. Corruption defined as a kind of crony capitalism where aspiring black bourgeoisie use the state to actually make money. It's got a name now, it's called state capture. You capture organs or livers of the state in order to enrich yourself. So when Zuma was kicked out, he was replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa. Many middle-class people were now saying, or are now saying, this is good, this is a solution. But for the working class, Ramaphosa is the man who said the police must use harsh action against the striking workers in Lonmin, the Marikana massacre. Before Ramaphosa became the president of the country, he was a billionaire capitalist. Already since he took over, he has increased value-added tax from 14% to 15%. He's a champion of new labor laws which seek to limit the right to strike. So, old Marxist analysis is applicable. A capitalist running a capitalist government cannot provide any solution for the poor, for the working class of South Africa. It is becoming clear that the workers who died in Marikana, they died because the capitalist system here, the government of the ANC, of the African National Congress, sought to maintain the cheap labor system upon which capitalism under apartheid thrived. So lastly, what we have seen since the Marikana massacre is growing combativity of the working class. Remember that when the workers were shot dead in Marikana, they still continued with their strike for 3 weeks after the massacre. This shows a great spirit, courage, a spirit of forward ever, backward never by the working class, a spirit of defiance. So we have seen rising combativity, and indeed, just before the Marikana massacre, you had all these ideas about the death of the working class. You know, the working class is no longer a revolutionary subject, as Marx had said, but Marikana changed all that and showed us and showed the country, in particular millions of working class people here, that the power to challenge the system lies with the working class. Indeed, it's not only workers. The political form of the challenge to capitalism in South Africa, or at least to the rising inequality, we see the youngest political party here, the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by Julius Malema, who was the leader of the Youth League of the ANC. This party, its official ideology is Marxism, Leninism, and Fanonism. With regard to the organized labor, we see the rise of the birth of a new trade union federation, the South African Federation of Trade Unions. It is led by Zolinzi Mavavi, who was kicked out of COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is in bed with the ANC, exactly because the alliance of the ANC, the Communist Party, and COSATU was failing to improve the lives of the working class. About a week or two ago, this new federation, SAFTU, called a successful general strike on April 25. And the strike was against Ramaphosa's anti-labor, anti-strike labor bills. There's a big union here, which is part of the new federation, NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers. It is busy organizing to form a workers' party. And that workers' party, its platform will be Marxism, Leninism. Of course, there are problems because there's still the baggage of Stalinism in some of these ideas, both in the economic freedom fighters and with NUMSA leaders around the Workers' Party. However, I don't think that Zolinzi Mavavi, the leader of SAFTU, Ivan Jim, can just repeat all the mistakes they made when they were still contained within the alliance. Also, they will tend to be pushed forward by the sheer combativity, momentum of the struggle on the ground. For example, after the general strike, already there is talk that SAFTU must call a 2-day general strike to press forward, the advantage we have. So I'll conclude by saying that here we did celebrate Marx's birthday. NUMSA had a whole week event. We had an event in some universities here, and indeed, the name of Marx is still revered here among the left. And everyone here is calling for radical economic change. Even the ANC, it tries to win back the support it is losing by calling for radical economic change. So I think the way forward is clear if we follow, Marxism as the unity of theory and practice, a struggle of the working class from below, looking towards an alternative to socialism. Thank you.